The Western Front was a graveyard of certainty. Orders were issued, plans drawn in perfect lines, and yet the battlefield consumed men and turned their stories into riddles. Among the countless episodes of slaughter in the Great War, few stand apart as enigmas. The raid on Celtic Wood in October 1917 is one of them. 71 men of the 10th Battalion, Australian Imperial Force, marched into a fog-thickened battlefield. They fought, destroyed enemy positions, and then, according to the record, ceased to exist. No mass grave, no prisoner lists, no survivors. It is this vanishing, in a war obsessed with counting the dead, that still draws us back.
By the autumn of 1917, the Great War had raged for more than 3 years. On the Western Front, both sides were exhausted, yet no closer to ending the conflict. The British High Command, under Field Marshal Douglas Haig, was committed to breaking through in Flanders to reach the Belgian coast and destroy the German submarine bases at Ostend and Zeebrugge. The chosen tool for this was the Third Battle of Ypres, later remembered by one grim name, Passchendaele. What began in July as a major offensive had devolved by October into a slow-motion battle through mud, shellfire, and ceaseless rain.
The Ypres salient was a bulge in the front lines around the ruined Belgian town of Ypres. It was hemmed in on 3 sides by German forces, making it a killing ground for artillery. Every square yard had been fought over again and again. The land had been pulverized into a morass by millions of shells. Drainage systems destroyed by bombardment left the ground waterlogged. The very earth seemed to resist human presence. Shell craters brimmed with brown water. Bodies, human and animal, lay buried in the mud, reappearing after rains or dislodged by new explosions. In this landscape, even a small rise in ground or a clump of trees could become a fortress.
Celtic Wood was not large. Before the war, it was a grove bordering farmland, its trees dense enough to shield cattle from the wind. The war transformed it into a nightmare. Months of shelling had stripped away leaves and bark. The trunks stood naked, splintered, and scarred. The undergrowth was gone, replaced by churned mud, tangled wire, and shattered timber. To the Germans, it was an observation point and a base for forward positions. From here, they could see much of the surrounding low ground and direct artillery fire on the Allies. To the British and Australians, it was a thorn in the line, one that needed removing, if only temporarily.
The 10th Battalion, Australian Imperial Force, was raised in South Australia in August 1914. It was among the first infantry units formed for the war, and one of the first ashore at Gallipoli in April 1915. After the evacuation from Gallipoli, they fought in France. Like all frontline units, it had been drained by casualties. New reinforcements arrived regularly from Australia, young men who had never heard a shot fired in anger until they reached the front. The veterans called them fair-faced boys, and some wondered how many would live to grow stubble. The raid on Celtic Wood would involve one company of the battalion, about 71 men, supported by engineers and a small artillery detachment.
Leading the raid was Captain Hugh Norman MacDonald. Tall, broad-shouldered, and known for an even temperament under fire, MacDonald had served with the 10th since its early days. He was respected for his ability to read a battlefield and make quick decisions, qualities essential for a raiding mission where seconds could decide survival. MacDonald's orders were clear: advance under cover of a creeping barrage, enter Celtic Wood, destroy German positions, dugouts, and stores, retreat before the enemy could counterattack. The mission was expected to take no more than 40 minutes inside the wood. In war planning terms, it was routine.
In the days before the raid, the men rehearsed behind the lines. Engineers demonstrated the use of explosives on mock dugouts. The infantry drilled in moving silently through timber and craters. Aerial photographs of Celtic Wood were passed around. The men studied every stump, every shadow, memorizing routes and landmarks. But they all knew that in battle, such details vanished into chaos. Fog, smoke, and shellfire erased the neat lines of the map within minutes. Still, discipline demanded the rehearsal. If nothing else, it kept the mind busy and dulled the edge of dread.
The night before the raid, the men were billeted in forward positions. They cleaned rifles, checked grenades, and distributed extra ammunition. Each man carried his Lee Enfield rifle, bayonet fixed, several Mills bombs, and in some cases, a trench knife. Rain fell intermittently, pattering on helmets and dripping into the duckboards. The ground sucked at their boots with each step. Some men smoked in silence. Others wrote quick notes to be sent if they did not return. At dusk, MacDonald moved among them, speaking quietly. He did not give speeches. He did not promise survival. He simply reminded them of their objectives and the timings.
At precisely 5:30 a.m. on October 9th, a British creeping barrage would open up in front of the Australian line. This moving curtain of shells would advance towards Celtic Wood at a steady pace, forcing the Germans to keep their heads down while the raiding party followed close behind. The timing was everything. Too close to the barrage, and the Australians risked being hit by their own shells. Too far behind, and the Germans would have time to recover and bring up machine guns. MacDonald's plan was to keep his men within 50 yards of the falling shells, dangerously close, but necessary for surprise.
At 4 a.m., the men assembled in their jumping-off positions. The fog was thick, beating on their tunics and dripping from rifle barrels. In the darkness, each man checked the gear of the man next to him. Slings adjusted, helmets straight, grenades secure. MacDonald consulted his watch by the dim light of a shielded torch. 90 minutes to go.
At 5:29 a.m., a hush settled over the forward trench. It was the kind of silence that only comes just before the guns open fire. A silence loaded with breath and heartbeat. 1 minute later, the first shells screamed overhead. The creeping barrage began, tearing into the ground ahead with deafening concussions. Clods of wet earth rained down, the air filled with the raw metallic tang of high explosive. MacDonald raised his arm. The men clambered over the parapet, boots sinking into the sodden ground. Ahead, the fog was lit in bursts of orange and white by shellfire, each flash revealing a jagged landscape of shattered trees and yawning craters.
The mud was not merely mud, it was a living, sucking thing. Every step pulled at ankles, pools of water hid beneath a thin skin of scum. The duckboards ended at the front line. From there on, it was raw, cratered earth. Some men stumbled, rifles slipping from grasp, caught in the net of twisted wire that littered the ground. Wire cutters clicked, men hauled each other free, and the line pressed on. They had to keep up with the barrage. If it outpaced them, the Germans would lift their heads.
They reached the outer fringe of Celtic Wood in less than 10 minutes. Here the ground was worse, roots exposed and blackened, craters overlapping, fragments of timber and steel embedded in the muck. The first German post fell quickly. A dugout entrance was spotted beneath a tangle of debris. 2 men pitched grenades down the stairwell. The blast blew smoke and dust back into the fog. Shouts in German echoed briefly, then fell silent. MacDonald signaled the engineers forward. They set a small charge to collapse the dugout entirely. The explosion rolled through the ground like an underground thunderclap.
The Australians moved in small groups, leapfrogging from cover to cover. Visibility was no more than 20 yards. The fog and smoke turned shapes into phantoms, sometimes friend, sometimes foe. Machine gun fire burst suddenly from their right. Bullets snapped past, splintering tree stumps. 2 men dropped instantly, one clutching his chest, the other pitched face first into the mud. A Lewis gun team swung into position, the gunner prone, assistant feeding the Pan magazine. The short hammering bursts cut through the fog. The machine gun fell silent.
Inside the wood, the fight became brutal and intimate. Grenades arced through the mist, detonating with sharp cracks that left ears ringing. Men clashed at bayonet point in the churned mud. The Germans fought hard for each position, retreating only when grenades and sheer momentum drove them back. The Australians worked methodically. Clear a post, set charges, move on. One sapper, Private William Hart, crawled forward under fire to place a satchel charge beneath a half-buried pillbox. He lit the fuse and rolled away. The blast tore the concrete structure apart, showering the area with fragments.
To anyone listening from outside, the wood would have sounded like the inside of a storm. The deep crump of hell's landing beyond, the whip crack of rifles, the clatter of machine guns, shouts, short, urgent, sometimes cut off mid-word. Over it all, the fog muffled and distorted the noise, making direction almost impossible to judge. Men often fired at movement without knowing who or what it was.
The creeping barrage was a double-edged sword. It shielded the Australians from immediate counterattack, but it did not wait. It was scheduled to move forward at fixed intervals, whether the infantry kept pace or not. By the 20-minute mark, the barrage had moved well beyond the far side of Celtic Wood. That meant the Germans to the rear were already recovering, remanning positions and possibly preparing to cut the Australians off. MacDonald knew the timing. He signaled for demolition to be completed quickly. Here, the first real problem emerged.
In the fog and confusion, runners sent with messages to the rear could not find their way back. The sound of the barrage ahead and scattered small arms fire created a disorienting acoustic maze. Men were now operating in pockets, small groups of 6 or 7, unsure where the others were. They could not see MacDonald, nor could they hear clear orders above the chaos.
German forces in nearby positions realized the barrage had moved on. They began to push forward toward the wood from multiple directions. In the mist, they used the same cover the Australians had: craters, stumps, wreckage. Occasional glimpses, a spiked helmet flashing in the gloom, a muzzle flash low to the ground, the white-hot streak of a flare hissing upward through the fog.
By about 35 minutes in, the Australians had set charges in multiple dugouts and destroyed several machine gun nests. The engineers were still placing explosives when rifle fire erupted from their rear, an unmistakable sign they were being encircled. MacDonald's last known order, according to a later account, was to keep moving to the flank, break through where it's thin. No one in the rear ever saw him again.
By 6 hours, the mist inside Celtic Wood had transformed into a choking, clinging haze mixed with gun smoke. Each artillery burst added new clouds of earth and splinters, drifting low, sticking to wet ground and skin. The Australians advanced in short rushes, but visibility was collapsing. Men were losing sight of the section ahead. Groups that started together in the assembly trench were now reduced to 2 or 3 men clinging to each other in the white-gray shroud.
Lieutenant William Bill Gatenby remembered hearing MacDonald's whistle somewhere to his right. He moved toward the sound, but was stopped by a thick tangle of uprooted trees. In the fog, distances became deceptive. What sounded like 20 yards away might be 100, or might be an echo from an entirely different direction. Compass bearings were useless. The landmarks marked on trench maps, the lone elm, the split oak, had been blown apart days earlier.
Small knots of soldiers began making independent decisions. Some continued to push forward, driven by the rolling barrage that was now moving eastward. Others turned back, hoping to regroup on the edge of the wood. One group, led by Corporal Henry Dawkins, ran into what they thought was an Australian demolition party. In reality, it was a German machine gun section moving between positions. The exchange of fire was brief and lethal. Dawkins' men were never seen again.
The Germans, recognizing the limited size of the Australian force, moved quickly to contain it. They shifted troops through the north end of the wood, blocking potential withdrawal paths. Rifle fire began to come from angles that suggested the enemy had already penetrated behind the Australians. Several witnesses spoke of being fired upon from both front and rear within minutes of entering the wood, a sign that the attackers were being boxed in.
At an artillery observation post west of the wood, officers with binoculars caught brief glimpses of men moving among the trees. The shapes were too indistinct to identify, but they assumed these were the Australians. Then a heavy concentration of German shells crashed into the same area. When the smoke drifted, there were no figures. The ground seemed empty.
Private Tom Leslie recounted in a letter, never published during the war, that he saw a mate ahead of him, silhouetted in a flash, waving to move forward. Leslie reached the spot within seconds, only to find churned mud and splintered roots. No man, no body. Others described hearing German voices, sometimes so close they seemed to be in the same shell hole, but seeing nothing through the fog. The sound would fade, then return from another direction entirely.
According to the 10th Battalion's unofficial notes, the last coordinated demolition work happened at approximately 0625. After that, there was no reliable account of the main body's actions. Some men may have followed the barrage deeper than intended. Others may have been forced into pockets of resistance they could not bypass. The lack of centralized communication, combined with the chaos of shellfire, meant that no one outside the wood knew exactly what was happening inside.
The final confirmed visual contact with the main demolition team came from Sergeant Alfred Alf Newman, positioned just west of the German bunker line. He saw Captain MacDonald rallying a handful of men near a shattered oak stump, gesturing toward a dugout entrance. Seconds later, a German mortar round landed nearby, blotting the scene in dirt and smoke. When it cleared, the men were gone. Whether they had been killed instantly or forced below ground was impossible to tell.
Several charges were planted at the base of German positions, timed to detonate minutes after placement. But post-war analysis found no craters where those particular targets stood, suggesting that some charges were never fired. If true, it meant the team had been interrupted, likely surrounded before they could complete their work. At 6:40,
Observers at the Australian trench line reported a sudden drop in small arms fire from inside Celtic Wood. For nearly 40 minutes, the fight had been a steady drumbeat of rifles, machine guns, and shouted orders. Now the bursts came sporadically, isolated, as if only a few pockets of resistance remained. By 6:50, even these had dwindled to nothing.
Back at Battalion HQ, officers expected to see returning sappers and infantry by 07. The rolling barrage had ended, and the attack window was officially closed. When none appeared, runners were sent to locate survivors. The first runner came back within 20 minutes, shaking his head. "Nothing, not a soul," he said. "It's like the ground swallowed them."
2 small patrols tried to enter the wood later that morning, but both were forced back by renewed German fire. The enemy now held the approaches in force, making further searches impossible without a major operation. This meant that for the rest of the day, no one on the Australian side had eyes on the lost men.
Interestingly, captured German soldiers later claimed they were unaware of any large Australian force inside Celtic Wood that morning. Some said they fought raiding parties, but nothing of company size. Others denied any contact at all. This contradiction puzzled Australian officers. If the Germans truly had not noticed, what had happened to over 70 armed men?
Among the ranks, rumors spread quickly. Some said the men had been trapped underground when German countercharges collapsed tunnels. Others whispered about being captured and executed quietly, their bodies hidden. The truth, whatever it was, remained sealed within the battered trees of Celtic Wood.
When the last sounds from Celtic Wood died away, the Australian line was eerily still. Men who had watched their comrades disappear into the fog now stared at the tree line in disbelief. The plan had been risky, but not suicidal. No one had expected the attacking force to simply vanish without returning fire or retreating in visible numbers. Officers knew they could not launch another daylight assault without heavy casualties. The enemy now had clear fields of fire, and any attempt to cross would be slaughtered.
Major Hutchinson, overseeing operations from a forward observation post, drafted his initial situation report for brigade headquarters. The document was curt, factual, and notably absent of speculation. Demolition party and supporting infantry entered Celtic Wood at 0530 hours. Sustained contact until approximately 0640 hours. No friendly forces observed withdrawing. Current status of party unknown. German resistance remains active at Wood perimeter. Further attempts at recovery presently impossible. This terse account would later become one of the few surviving official descriptions of the event.
By evening, adjutants in the 52nd Battalion began compiling preliminary casualty lists. These lists were not declarations of death, but missing in action notations. Families would receive telegrams stating only that their son or husband was missing following an engagement on October 9, 1917. For many, missing was a worse word than dead. It implied uncertainty, a cruel limbo in which hope could not fully die.
Near midnight, 2 soldiers stumbled back into the Australian lines. Both were exhausted, mud-caked, and partially deaf from shell fire. One had a bandaged arm, the other a leg wound packed with field dressing. Their account was disjointed. They claimed to have been separated during the push, hiding in a shell crater until darkness allowed them to crawl back. They saw no sign of the rest of the men. They could not even confirm whether Captain MacDonald was alive when they last heard him.
Within days, Celtic Wood became a whispered topic in nearby units. The story spread beyond the battalion, each telling adding its own shadow. Some swore that German patrols were seen dragging Australian bodies toward the rear. Others claimed to have heard muffled detonations underground hours after the fight ended, as if charges had gone off too late.
At the time, Australian and British newspapers printed almost nothing about Celtic Wood. Official communiques spoke vaguely of local actions near Broodside and Poolkapelle, omitting details. Whether this was due to operational security, the embarrassment of unexplained losses, or a desire to avoid morale damage remains unclear.
The 52nd Battalion's War Diary for October 9th contains a short, almost dismissive entry. Demolition raid on Celtic Wood. Party did not return. Considerable hostile fire encountered. Objective not secured. It is the understatement of the war. For the families of the 71 men, that single line was all the official record would hold for decades.
By the time the battalion was rotated out of the front line, Celtic Wood was already fading from official conversation. Larger battles loomed. The Somme and Passchendaele consumed attention and resources. But for those who had been there, the unanswered question lingered. How could so many vanish in full daylight in sight of their own lines without a single confirmed body recovered? This unanswered question would survive the war, haunting historians and descendants for more than a century.
The morning after the chaos of Celtic Wood, the official record was thin. Brigade and divisional headquarters were flooded with reports of casualties, small actions, and routine patrols. Among this torrent, the absence of over 70 men from the 10th Battalion stood out, but only slightly. The war had become a machine of loss. Thousands went missing across the Western Front in a single week. Commanders were trained to catalog the missing, but not to dwell on the impossible questions. Where exactly were they? Were they alive, wounded, captured, or already dead? Major Hutchison's field report on October 10th was terse. Demolition party did not return from Celtic Wood. No confirmation of casualties or survivors. Efforts to ascertain location unsuccessful. Enemy positions prevent immediate recovery. This entry, brief and almost dismissive, would later be cited in official histories. It was written in a manner that suggested procedure over humanity, a signature of military bureaucracy during the Great War.
Within the battalion, whispers had already begun. Soldiers who had witnessed men vanish into the fog offered conflicting testimony. Private Tom Leslie, who had been separated from his section, claimed he saw Captain MacDonald signaling toward a shell-scarred grove, then disappear behind a broken oak. Another man, Sergeant Newman, recounted hearing shouting, the clash of rifles, and then silence. These testimonies were rarely collected immediately. Letters sent home to families were censored, official interrogations delayed. Many accounts would only appear decades later in personal memoirs or oral histories, often heavily influenced by fading memory, the passage of trauma, and the desire to explain the inexplicable.
Immediately after the engagement, small Australian patrols attempted to penetrate the wood and locate survivors. Mud, debris, and a recovering German defensive posture prevented any thorough search. Patrols reported scattered items, abandoned helmets, a few rifles, a broken shovel, and remnants of explosive charges, all suggestive of sudden departure or catastrophe. The Germans, meanwhile, fortified their positions, seemingly unaware or deliberately silent about the missing Australians. Some German soldiers claimed they saw only minor incursions, adding confusion to already fragmentary reports.
Historians decades later would comb the National Archives of Australia, the UK National Archives, and local war diaries. The documents are meticulous in format, but sparse in meaningful content regarding Celtic Wood. War diaries? Notations list the men as missing in action, with occasional mention of small parties observed in wooded area. There is no clarification of exact positions or outcomes. Casualty lists. Posted in battalion headquarters and sent to families, these lists simply indicated unaccounted for, a bureaucratic euphemism that concealed the mystery behind sterile language. Reports from German prisoners. Interrogations after the war offered some insight, yet German records were either incomplete or contradictory, failing to confirm engagement with a large Australian unit in that sector. Modern historians examining Celtic Wood note that the terrain itself contributed heavily to confusion. Dense forest, thick undergrowth, blown-apart trees, and fallen artillery shells created a natural maze. Shell craters up to 10 feet deep, scattered throughout the wood, impeded movement and made line of sight virtually impossible. The terrain's role cannot be overstated. Even the most disciplined unit could easily splinter, become isolated, or be trapped in pockets where communication was impossible.
In the weeks following the battle, several theories circulated within the army. 1. Buried by collapse. Some hypothesized that partially detonated charges, combined with shell explosions, caused temporary underground collapses, trapping men without evidence remaining on the surface. 2. Captured by Germans. Another theory suggested a silent capture, with prisoners moved behind lines and either interned or executed quietly. 3. Dispersal and death in action. A simpler explanation is that small groups were killed in pockets, bodies unrecovered due to battlefield conditions. None of these could be verified immediately. Lack of survivors, hostile terrain, and minimal reporting created a vacuum in which rumor and speculation flourished. For families and comrades, the lack of closure was devastating. Letters sent home conveyed official language, missing in action. Behind these phrases were mothers and fathers, sisters and wives, left to imagine the fate of loved ones. The psychological impact was significant, shaping narratives and oral histories for decades. Veterans who survived Celtic Wood often refrained from discussing the missing men. Silence was common, partly from trauma and partly from the futility of speculation amid overwhelming loss.
By the end of the first day of investigation, the official record was established. 71 men unaccounted for, no verified survivors, no conclusive enemy engagement noted, terrain impassable, and early witness testimony scattered and unreliable. The seed of the Celtic Wood mystery had taken root, a puzzle that would span decades, challenging historians, descendants, and military analysts alike.
Years after the battle, some survivors of the 10th Battalion began to recount their experiences. Private William Hargreaves, interviewed in the 1950s, described the dense fog that swallowed the unit as they advanced. "We thought we could see our mates, and then, in a moment, they were gone. Not a shot, not a scream, just gone. The forest itself seemed to take them." Hargreaves' account, like many others, emphasized the disorienting combination of fog, shell damage, and psychological strain. For men who had survived Passchendaele and Broodseinde, this event remained uniquely haunting. Sergeant Arthur Newman, another witness, recalled how small groups of men became isolated, forming knots of resistance that were systematically overtaken by the environment and enemy fire. He noted the silence that fell once the initial clash ended. It was as if the wood swallowed them. You could hear nothing, not even the birds. Just mud, trees, and a silence that pressed on you.
After the armistice in 1918, official efforts began to trace missing men. Military intelligence departments requested records from surviving battalion officers, local German command logs, and field reports. These post-war investigations revealed several patterns. Fragmentary German records, some German units recorded sightings of small Australian parties entering Celtic Wood, but the reports lacked any mention of mass engagement. Many of these records were incomplete or lost during retreats. Dispersal and recovery attempts, Australian patrols occasionally found abandoned equipment, including shovels, helmets, and packs, suggesting that men had been forced to leave in a hurry. No mass graves were found. Unlike some other engagements, no single site contained evidence of a group of 71 men, supporting theories of dispersal, capture, or concealment. These investigations highlighted the limitations of post-war reconstruction. In an environment as chaotic as the Western Front, even extensive records could fail to account for every movement, particularly in heavily shelled woodland.
Decades later, memoirs became an invaluable source. Several former soldiers, interviewed in the 1940s and 1950s, recalled small details that did not appear in official records. Unexpected obstacles, collapsed trees, hidden shell craters, and the swamp-like ground made coordinated movement nearly impossible. Auditory confusion. Soldiers frequently mistook distant artillery or gunfire for actions in their immediate vicinity, creating false perceptions of troop movements. Psychological impact. Anxiety, fear, and fatigue contributed to disorientation, with men losing track of comrades during moments of intense engagement. Historians later synthesized these accounts to understand how the fog, terrain, and human perception combined to produce the vanishing phenomenon.
In the early 1920s, Australian military historians compiled post-war summaries of the 10th Battalion's engagements. Celtic Wood received only a few paragraphs noting the battalion's advance, casualties, and missing men. A key excerpt from one report reads, quote, "While the battalion entered Celtic Wood as ordered, 71 men failed to return. No verified engagement with the enemy occurred that accounts for all missing, and attempts at post-action recovery yielded negligible evidence." The wording underscores the bureaucratic frustration in explaining the unexplainable. Many historians later cited this as one of the most perplexing cases of missing personnel in the Great War.
Unit diaries. War diaries contained fragmented mentions of small parties separated and unverified sightings of missing men. German intelligence files, some documents suggested minor skirmishes with isolated Australian parties, but none accounted for a full battalion-sized force. Map annotations. Officers' field maps revealed planned demolition points and trench layouts, but offered no insight into the mass disappearance. The archival record presents a fragmented puzzle.
Gaps in documentation leave historians relying on triangulation between personal accounts, partial records, and the terrain itself.
Using surviving diaries, maps, and photographs, modern military analysts attempted to reconstruct the 10th Battalion's path. Key findings. The unit entered the wood along 3 main axes, intending to reach demolition objectives. Narrow paths and obstructed routes created natural choke points. Groups quickly became separated, unable to maintain line of sight or communication. The fog, combined with smoke from shelling, magnified disorientation. This reconstruction highlights how terrain and chaos can render even disciplined soldiers invisible to one another.
Over time, several unverified reports emerged. Local civilians claimed seeing Australians taken prisoner and marched away by Germans, though documentation is lacking. Some veterans reported hearing muffled explosions long after initial combat, possibly indicating secondary detonations. Letters and diaries hint at panic and confusion among isolated groups, yet none provide concrete evidence of mass survival or capture. These anecdotes, though unverified, sustained the mystery of Celtic Wood through generations.
Historians applying modern forensic and geographical analysis note topographical challenges. Celtic Wood's heavily cratered landscape naturally concealed troop movements. Combat stress. Auditory and visual distortions during battle may have created false perceptions of missing comrades. Enemy observation. Germans likely noticed only fragments of the battalion. They did not report engaging a full unit. The combination of terrain, chaos, and fragmented record-keeping means any definitive explanation remains elusive.
Survivors consistently report guilt, feeling responsible for those who vanished, confusion, inability to reconcile the events with expectations of warfare, silence. Many refrained from recounting the events, fearing judgment or being misunderstood. These psychological layers contribute to the human dimension of the mystery, making Celtic Wood more than just a historical puzzle. It is a study in trauma and the limits of human perception under extreme stress.
By the end of post-war investigations and testimony analysis, official records confirmed 71 men missing. Personal accounts described fog, disorientation, and sudden disappearance. Terrain analysis explained partial separation but not total vanishing. No mass graves or documented captures accounted for the entire group.
As decades passed, historians and amateur researchers attempted to explain the disappearance at Celtic Wood. The lack of concrete evidence allowed multiple hypotheses to emerge. These theories ranged from plausible tactical explanations to more speculative ideas bordering on the mysterious. 1. Tactical isolation theory. Military analysts suggested that the battalion split into small groups during the advance due to terrain complexity. Shell craters, fallen trees, and dense undergrowth impeded coordinated movement. The fog of war, both literal and metaphorical, meant that soldiers who were separated could not regroup, and many likely succumbed individually to enemy fire or exhaustion. 2. Capture and concealment hypothesis. Some historians proposed that a German unit captured isolated Australians but kept the operation secret, either due to operational sensitivity or failure to record it accurately. However, post-war German records and interrogations did not confirm a mass capture corresponding to 71 men. 3. Environmental catastrophe possibility. Another line of inquiry examined the effect of secondary detonations from partially buried explosives. Artillery bombardments and demolition charges could have caused sudden collapses in cratered areas, creating localized traps where groups might be buried temporarily. While no mass graves were found, small debris-filled pits could explain some individual disappearances. 4. Psychological and perception-based theories. Experts in combat psychology suggested that extreme stress, exhaustion, and auditory visual confusion could result in collective misperception. Soldiers separated in thick fog might have perceived comrades vanishing, a phenomenon compounded by fragmented reports and chaotic battle conditions.
Military historians in the late 20th century revisited Celtic Wood with advanced methodologies. GIS mapping. Using historical maps, aerial reconnaissance, and modern topographical data, analysts traced likely movement paths of the battalion. These studies confirmed that multiple groups became geographically isolated. Ballistics and artillery analysis. Simulations of artillery barrages indicated that certain sectors of the wood were effectively impassable during the attack, increasing casualty likelihood and contributing to disappearances.
Photographic Evidence Review. Surviving photographs of Celtic wood, trenches, and battlefield debris were analyzed for traces of missing personnel, equipment, or engagement patterns, though no definitive evidence of mass loss beyond documented casualties was discovered.
In the 1970s and 1980s, dedicated field historians conducted controlled surveys in the Celtic Wood area. Metal detection and archaeological excavation, researchers located scattered artifacts, bayonets, helmets, and shell fragments, but no mass burial sites. Environmental reconstructions. The surveys documented soil composition changes, drainage patterns, and shell crater distribution to explain difficulties in battlefield recovery operations. Geographic disorientation mapping. Areas of particularly dense undergrowth and fog retention were highlighted as a zone where soldiers could easily become separated and unaccounted for. These efforts reinforced the notion that the battalion's disappearance was multifactorial, combining terrain, fog, combat stress, and battlefield chaos.
Veterans' families contributed oral histories, sometimes decades later, describing faint recollections or rumors. Some claimed that relatives had hinted at seeing men carried off by unknown forces. Others recalled letters from soldiers, cryptic in tone, referencing the swallowing wood or lost boys, phrases suggestive of confusion and fear rather than definitive events. While anecdotal, these accounts highlight the human dimension of Celtic wood, the fear, uncertainty, and unrecorded trauma experienced by both survivors and the families waiting at home.
Combining archival, testimonial, and modern analytical data, historians outline several converging factors. 1. Terrain-induced fragmentation. Dense forest, fog, and shell craters caused physical separation. 2. Communication breakdown. Orders failed to propagate, leaving groups without coordination. 3. Enemy engagement. Limited skirmishes may have eliminated or captured isolated individuals. 4. Environmental hazards. Explosions, collapsed terrain, and swampy ground contributed to casualties. 5. Record-keeping limitations. Post-war documentation could not fully account for chaotic battlefield realities. This synthesis suggests a complex interplay of human, environmental, and operational factors, a multifaceted explanation without definitive closure.
Celtic Wood's disappearance has prompted debate among military historians. Some argue for a purely tactical explanation, emphasizing miscommunication and terrain hazards. Others speculate external forces, possibly overlooked in post-war intelligence reports. A few suggest a psychological layer, asserting that wartime trauma and memory distortion influence both survivors and historians' interpretations. The debate continues, emphasizing that historical certainty is elusive when contemporary documentation is incomplete and battlefield conditions extreme.
Modern researchers and enthusiasts have applied new technologies. Drone surveys. Aerial drones provide 3D reconstructions of Celtic wood, mapping shell craters and vegetation. Digital archives. Scanned diaries, letters, and photographs are cross-referenced to identify overlooked evidence. Forensic anthropology. Attempts to locate remains have largely failed, but soil analyses inform probabilities of unmarked burial. These contemporary efforts highlight the enduring fascination and scholarly challenge of Celtic wood, bridging decades of mystery with emerging investigative methods.
The story of the 71 men resonates because it combines fact, human experience, and dramatic mystery. Each lost soldier represents a narrative fragment of courage, fear, and confusion. The battalion's advance, the fog, and the terrain form a cinematic backdrop for the human struggle. Historians, families, and researchers collectively sustain the memory of the vanished, ensuring that the mystery remains poignant and emotionally compelling.
By the end of modern analysis, tactical, environmental, psychological, and record-keeping factors all contribute to the enduring mystery. Despite decades of research, the full fate of the 71 men remains unresolved, making Celtic wood a symbol of the chaotic, often unknowable realities of war. The blend of documentary evidence, survivor testimony, and environmental analysis provides the deepest understanding possible without definitive closure, preserving both factual integrity and narrative drama.
Even as the war dragged on, the disappearance of the 71 men of Celtic Wood cast a long shadow over both their comrades and the families at home.
In the weeks following October 9, 1917, rumors spread rapidly across the Allied lines. Soldiers whispered about groups swallowed by the forest, while officers tried to maintain operational focus despite growing unease. Letters sent home were vague, often omitting the harshest realities to spare families further anguish. This atmosphere of uncertainty planted the first seeds of myth. Families clung to hope, yet the lack of concrete information allowed imagination to fill in the gaps. Contemporary newspapers, constrained by wartime censorship, reported only minimal details, heightening the mystery and anxiety surrounding the battalion.
By the end of 1917, Celtic Wood began to enter a quasi-legendary status among soldiers and officers alike. Oral transmission in the ranks. Stories circulated of men vanishing without trace. Some recounted faint cries heard across shell-scarred craters, while others told of soldiers seen moving erratically, lost in the fog. These accounts, though fragmented, created a narrative of incomprehensible disappearance. Symbol of war's chaos. Military historians later noted that Celtic Wood represented the uncontrollable forces of trench warfare, terrain, artillery, and human error coalescing into an almost supernatural level of unpredictability. The battalion's vanishing became shorthand for the fragility of coordinated military operations under extreme conditions. Early commemoration efforts. Though no mass grave existed, immediate memorials and rolls of honor incorporated the missing. Plaques and local Australian regimental halls listed the names of the 71, ensuring that even without physical remains, the soldiers' identities endured.
In the 1920s and 1930s, memoirs and post-war literature began to treat Celtic Wood with a mix of historical and literary interpretation. Veterans' memoirs. Soldiers who survived the assault recounted personal experiences in journals and memoirs. Accounts focused on fragmented combat, disorientation, and the emotional toll of losing comrades without closure. Literary treatments. War poets and chroniclers occasionally reference the battalion's fate to illustrate the absurdity and horror of trench warfare. While dramatic, these writings stayed rooted in the factual basis of disappearance and battlefield conditions. Official war histories. Australian and British military historians documented the event with cautious language, highlighting tactical errors and environmental factors rather than speculative supernatural elements.
Celtic Wood evolved as a symbol of the lost generation of World War I. 1. An archetype of missing soldiers. The battalion's fate became emblematic of soldiers who disappeared in battle without physical evidence. This resonated with families worldwide who never received closure. 2. Integration into national consciousness. In Australia, memorials and regimental histories cited the battalion as part of the broader narrative of the Anzac experience. In Britain, the event appeared in specialized military histories illustrating operational hazards in the Ypres salient. 3. Artistic representation. Paintings and illustrations depicting Celtic Wood emphasized fog, chaos, and fragmentation, reinforcing its visual identity as a place of mystery and loss.
By the mid-20th century, historians started analyzing Celtic Wood systematically. Archival research. Scholars scrutinized war diaries, casualty reports, and German archives to identify gaps or corroborate anecdotal evidence. Operational analysis. Military tacticians assessed the impact of terrain, artillery barrages, and fog of war on unit cohesion. Socio-cultural interpretation. Researchers explored how collective memory and myth-making shaped perceptions of the event over decades. The interplay of factual reconstruction and emergent legend became a central theme in historiography, acknowledging both the documented reality and the stories passed down.
Even before comprehensive investigations were possible, local and regimental commemorations began. 1. Regimental rolls of honor. Officers ensured that the 71 men were listed in official rolls, treated as missing in action with footnotes explaining the ambiguity. 2. Plaques and memorials. Small-scale memorials in Australian regimental halls and European cemeteries symbolized remembrance. These sites became focal points for visiting families, offering emotional continuity despite the lack of graves. 3. Public ceremonies. Occasional services and wreath-laying ceremonies reinforced the battalion's presence in public consciousness, creating a narrative that merged fact with ritualized memory. As years passed, the line between historical fact and legend blurred in popular culture. Exaggeration and anecdote, soldiers' stories often embellished events, contributing to perceived supernatural qualities of the disappearance. Literary interpretations. Authors occasionally used Celtic wood as a motif for the randomness and futility of war. Enduring questions. Even well-documented research could not fully account for all missing soldiers, perpetuating intrigue. The story of Celtic wood transcended national boundaries. Australian perspective, seen as part of Anzac legacy, emphasizing courage and sacrifice under impossible conditions. British perspective, incorporated into studies of the Ypres salient and operational missteps. Global military historiography, analysts examined Celtic wood as a case study in small unit disappearance, offering lessons for future military planning and battlefield safety analysis.
The battalion's fate left long-term psychological effects. Survivor guilt. Soldiers who returned often grappled with guilt over comrades who vanished, influencing memoirs and letters. Family anxiety. Families experienced decades of uncertainty, shaping personal narratives and community memory. Historical curiosity. Scholars, enthusiasts, and descendants maintained a constant inquiry into the unresolved disappearance, ensuring the battalion remained part of military cultural discourse.
After the immediate post-war period, historians began systematic examinations of the Celtic wood disappearance. By the 1950s and 1960s, scholars highlighted inconsistencies between war diaries, casualty reports, personal letters, and memoirs. These inconsistencies prompted discussions about command errors, environmental hazards, and the possibility that some soldiers had temporarily survived in isolated sections of the battlefield. Tactical analysis. Military historians examined the 10th Battalion's advance, artillery timings, and the effect of fog on coordination. Archival cross-checking. British, Australian, and German records were compared to reconcile the numbers of reported casualties and disappearances. Historical contextualization. The Ypres salient's extreme conditions, mud, craters, shell fire, and dense woodland, were noted as critical contributors to disorientation and loss.
Modern historians employed a combination of maps, aerial photography, and field research to reconstruct the battalion's advance. 1. Path mapping. Battalion movements were plotted against terrain features, artillery zones, and trench locations. 2. Environmental hazards. Shell craters, fallen trees, and waterlogged ground created physical obstacles that slowed troop cohesion. 3. Artillery and fog. Timed barrages and limited visibility contributed to soldiers becoming isolated in small groups, complicating command control. These reconstructions, though technical, provided a vivid visual understanding of how 71 men could vanish without trace.
From the 1980s onward, a new wave of field investigations sought concrete evidence. Archaeological surveys using metal detectors, trench outlines, and landscape analysis to locate artifacts or remains. GIS and mapping technology, overlaying historical maps onto modern topography, allowed researchers to estimate precise battalion positions. Oral histories, descendants and local witnesses were interviewed to capture stories passed down through generations. While no definitive new discoveries emerged, these efforts reaffirmed the complexity of Celtic wood and the practical impossibility of full recovery.
Survivor testimony remained a critical component of the historiography. Consistency across accounts. Despite personal biases and trauma, recurring details emerged: fog, disorientation, and sudden artillery barrages. Discrepancies in memory distortion. Stress, shock, and time had altered recollections, complicating historical certainty. Psychological interpretation. Scholars emphasized how trauma influenced perception, leading to the partial mythologizing of events. Modern historians debated multiple angles. 1. Command and tactical failures. Some argued that errors in orders and miscommunication were primary contributors. 2. Environmental determinism. Others focused on the harsh terrain and unpredictable weather. 3. Human factors. Stress, fatigue, and morale were considered pivotal in troop disintegration. Each perspective was supported by archival evidence, but none could fully account for the complete disappearance, keeping the mystery alive.
Even scholarly analyses acknowledge the persistent mythologization. Narrative necessity. Gaps in evidence encouraged narrative speculation, emphasizing dramatic elements of disappearance.
symbolic resonance. Celtic wood became emblematic of chaos and uncertainty in modern military history. Cross-disciplinary appeal. Anthropologists, psychologists, and sociologists reference the event in discussions of memory, trauma, and collective storytelling.
To visualize and analyze battalion movements, reenactments, small-scale simulations by historians and enthusiasts recreated timing, formation, and battlefield conditions. Drone imaging, modern aerial photography mapped forest density and crater patterns. Terrain analysis, soil studies, and vegetation mapping revealed changes since 1917, confirming that many obstacles faced by the battalion were extraordinary. These methods bridged historical reconstruction with visual narrative, allowing audiences to experience the disappearance in a controlled, factual way.
Re-examination of original war diaries, casualty lists, and correspondence led to subtle insights. Some soldiers may have become temporarily trapped in small, forested sectors. Certain German unit logs indicated skirmishes in specific areas, providing partial confirmation of fragmented contact. Memoirs occasionally referenced hearing distant cries or seeing shadows among fog, giving historians qualitative data supporting battlefield chaos.
By the 21st century, Celtic Wood's story had evolved into a case study. Military strategy. Analysis emphasizes the danger of small unit isolation in complex terrain. Memory studies. The interplay of trauma, oral history, and myth illustrates how historical events persist in collective consciousness. Cultural significance. Celtic Wood features in documentaries, museum exhibits, and online archives as an enduring symbol of wartime uncertainty.
Interest in Celtic wood persists. Descendant inquiries, families continue to seek closure through letters, visits, and genealogical research. Documentary coverage. Modern storytelling integrates archival material, survivor accounts, and expert analysis. Virtual reconstructions. 3D battlefield modeling allows immersive exploration without disturbing historical sites. Each attempt highlights both the limits of evidence and the human fascination with unresolved disappearance.
Celtic wood remains emotionally potent. Commemoration ceremonies, families and regimental units still honor the missing annually. Educational narratives. Schools and military programs use the story to teach strategy, courage, and the unpredictability of war. And literary and media representation. Books, articles, and online media frame the battalion's fate as a symbol of loss, heroism, and enduring mystery. Educational outreach. Schools and historical societies use Celtic wood as a case study for battlefield hazards, missing personnel, and wartime decision-making.
Even decades after the First World War, the fate of the 71 men of Celtic wood has continued to resonate in both Australia and Britain. The battalion's disappearance became a symbolic touchstone for understanding the human cost of war. Memorials, both in Europe and Australia, commemorate the lost soldiers, incorporating their names into walls of remembrance, plaques, and rolls of honor. Regimental ceremonies. Regiments affiliated with the 10th Battalion hold annual ceremonies, acknowledging the sacrifice and the unresolved nature of the disappearance. Community engagement. Descendants and local communities maintain historical awareness through gatherings, exhibitions, and storytelling sessions. Educational outreach. Schools and historical societies use Celtic wood as a case study for battlefield hazards, missing personnel, and wartime decision-making.
The story of Celtic wood has persisted in books, documentaries, and digital media. Documentary retellings? Programs often combine archival footage, battlefield reconstructions, and expert interviews to dramatize the battalion's fate without straying from documented facts. Books and articles. Historians continue to explore the disappearance, presenting both operational analysis and personal narratives of the soldiers and their families. And digital storytelling. Online archives, forums, and virtual reconstructions provide immersive experiences, allowing modern audiences to engage with the history interactively.
The battalion's fate has had long-lasting psychological and emotional effects on multiple generations. Survivor impact, those who returned struggled with guilt and trauma, influencing memoirs and oral histories. Family grief, families of the missing lived for decades without closure, shaping personal and collective memory. Broader symbolism, Celtic wood has come to represent the unpredictability and brutality of trench warfare, conveying lessons about resilience, loss, and human endurance.
Recent decades have seen renewed interest in resolving lingering questions.
Archaeological fieldwork, surveys of Celtic wood have examined terrain changes, potential artifact locations, and evidence of trench collapse or battlefield hazards. GIS mapping and 3D reconstructions allow historians to visualize battalion movements, artillery zones, and forest density in ways previously impossible. Oral histories and digital archives, combined with accessible war diaries and reports, contribute to a nuanced understanding of the event.
Celtic Wood occupies a unique space in military historiography. Case study in disappearance. The battalion's fate illustrates challenges of unit cohesion, environmental hazards, and fog of war effects. Intersection of fact and narrative. Historians balance operational analysis with the psychological and cultural impact of the disappearance. Enduring questions. Despite rigorous investigation, some aspects remain unresolved, fostering continued debate and research interest.
The unresolved nature of Celtic wood amplifies its presence in collective memory. 1. Symbol of the missing. The battalion exemplifies soldiers who vanish without trace, an archetype repeated in military history. 2. Inspiration for storytelling. Writers, filmmakers, and digital content creators draw upon Celtic wood as a narrative device, emphasizing unpredictability, bravery, and human cost. 3. Educational relevance. The story teaches future generations about operational complexity, risk assessment, and ethical responsibility in warfare.
The disappearance continues to affect families, historians, and enthusiasts. Descendant engagement. Families maintain personal narratives, sometimes combining letters, photographs, and oral histories to preserve memory. Historical societies. Organizations document ongoing research and engage the public with exhibitions, lectures, and commemorative events. Digital archives and online communities. Platforms allow worldwide participation, fostering collective remembrance and facilitating research sharing.
Despite extensive research, several questions remain. Exact fate of the 71 men. Fragmented reports and battlefield complexity prevent definitive conclusions. Impact of environmental hazards. Dense fog, cratered terrain, and artillery contributed, but specifics of individual movements are unclear. Role of command decisions. Orders, timing, and miscommunication are analyzed, yet full understanding eludes historians. The unresolved elements ensure Celtic wood remains a subject of intrigue, scholarship, and public curiosity.
The story is referenced in military education and strategic studies. Training example, lessons on small unit operations, terrain navigation, and battlefield coordination. Symbolic reference, used to illustrate the fragility of plans in complex operational environments. Commemorative awareness. Units visiting memorial sites reflect on historical continuity, sacrifice, and operational challenges.
Ultimately, Celtic Wood's legacy is both emotional and intellectual. Emotional, the disappearance of 71 men resonates as a human tragedy, influencing descendants and communities. Intellectual, historians continue to analyze tactical, environmental, and psychological factors, adding depth to military scholarship. Narrative, the story persists as a compelling historical mystery, combining verifiable fact with human drama.
The disappearance of the 71 men at Celtic Wood provided critical insights for military historians and strategists. Despite the tragic loss, analyses of the event revealed the challenges of coordination in densely forested terrain, especially under artillery barrages. Commanders often underestimated the complexity of the Ypres salient, and post-war studies frequently cited the Celtic Wood engagement as a cautionary example in small unit operations. Lessons in terrain analysis. The dense woodland, cratered landscape, and wet soil limited mobility and visibility, demonstrating how environmental factors can decisively affect engagement outcomes. Operational coordination. Orders often failed to adapt to the rapid changes in battlefield conditions, emphasizing the importance of flexible command structures. Communication breakdowns. The fog, artillery noise, and rapidly shifting positions meant that signals and runners were frequently delayed or lost, leading to fragmentation of units.
One of the enduring elements of Celtic Wood is the human dimension. Men were trained, equipped, and drilled, yet the chaos of battle overrode preparation. Survivor reports detail confusion, exhaustion, and emotional strain, highlighting that even meticulously planned operations can unravel under intense pressure. fatigue, and morale. Soldiers advancing into unknown terrain after prolonged periods in the trenches often experienced physical and mental exhaustion, which compounded the dangers of combat. Decision-making under duress. Officers had to make split-second choices with incomplete information, illustrating the persistent tension between protocol and adaptability. Cohesion and fragmentation. The battalion's eventual scattering into smaller groups underscores the fragility of unit cohesion in extreme conditions.
The lessons from Celtic Wood influenced interwar military thought. Analysts considered how small unit tactics, reconnaissance, and combined arms coordination could prevent similar disasters. Publications and war colleges studied the engagement, deriving practical takeaways. Enhanced training in terrain navigation. The difficulties faced in wooded, cratered battlefields highlighted the necessity of specialized training. Improved communication methods. Later doctrines emphasized redundant communication systems to mitigate the risks of misalignment and miscommunication. Psychological preparation. Recognizing the mental strain of prolonged combat became a formal part of post-war training programs.
Celtic Wood's story transcended battlefield analysis and entered the cultural consciousness. Memorials, regimental histories, and commemorative ceremonies reinforced the link between sacrifice and remembrance. Scholars and military historians have since examined the engagement from multiple perspectives, ensuring that the lessons are preserved alongside the memory of the lost soldiers. Regimental histories. Official accounts often emphasize heroism and the confusion inherent in combat. Public memory. Commemorations fostered understanding of the human costs of war while educating future generations. Scholarly reassessment. Modern research incorporates archaeological surveys, GIS mapping, and critical analysis to refine historical understanding.
Accounts from surviving soldiers provide a vivid and personal view of the chaos. Descriptions include mist-laden woods, cratered terrain, and the deafening roar of artillery. These testimonies are invaluable for reconstructing the battalion's movements and understanding the psychological pressures of those who faced overwhelming odds. Fragmented movements. Many survivors report losing sight of comrades within minutes, illustrating the rapid dispersion of the battalion. Environmental challenges. Mud, shell holes, and fallen trees hindered progress, creating natural traps. Auditory overload. Continuous artillery barrages disoriented soldiers and impeded coordination, a factor often overlooked in operational planning.
Historians and military archaeologists have meticulously reviewed war diaries, official reports, and battlefield surveys. These sources reveal patterns in troop deployment, casualty distribution, and terrain navigation, offering critical insights that complement survivor accounts. War diaries, detailed daily entries reveal command decisions, unit locations, and casualty reports. Maps and reconstructions overlaying historical maps with modern GIS data clarifies potential battalion movements. Physical evidence, artifacts recovered during surveys corroborate accounts of artillery impact zones, trench locations, and unit dispersion.
The disappearance of the battalion left lasting psychological and cultural imprints. Families grappled with absence, communities processed collective trauma, and veterans carried the memory of fallen comrades. The event also fueled literary and artistic representations of the First World War's unpredictability and cost. Family memory, letters, and personal accounts preserved emotional continuity across generations. Community rituals, annual ceremonies, and memorials maintained public awareness and reflected communal grief. And artistic expression, poetry, memoirs, and later digital media captured the tension, loss, and heroism inherent in the engagement.
Over decades, Celtic Wood has remained a subject of sustained scholarly interest. Historians continually reassess the events, balancing operational analysis with human experience. The battalion's disappearance serves as a case study for the complex interplay of command decisions, terrain, and chance. Archival reassessment. Modern scholars revisit war diaries, operational orders, and post-war reports to reconstruct plausible sequences of events. Comparative analysis. Cross-examination with other small unit engagements in similar terrain provides insight into recurring tactical challenges. Myth versus fact. Historians carefully distinguish anecdotal survivor accounts from verified operational records, preserving narrative integrity.
Recent decades have witnessed renewed interest in fieldwork and technological reconstruction. Using advanced methodologies, historians and archaeologists seek to clarify unresolved aspects of the battle. GIS and 3D mapping, overlaying historical maps with present-day satellite imagery, allows precise tracking of battalion movements, artillery zones, and terrain obstacles. Battlefield archaeology, systematic surveys of Celtic wood, recover artifacts and trench remnants, providing tangible evidence to complement documentary sources. Forensic techniques, analysis of discovered objects, shell fragments, and soil disturbance patterns informs reconstruction of the battalion's final positions. Celtic Wood's story has permeated public consciousness, influencing education, media, and cultural narratives. Documentaries and publications retell the battalion's fate with careful adherence to factual accuracy, dramatizing events without exaggeration. Memorial visits, annual pilgrimages by descendants, military units, and enthusiasts reinforce cultural memory and the human dimension of historical study. Digital archives, interactive maps, and forums allow global audiences to explore and contribute to ongoing research.
Operational scrutiny reveals critical lessons in leadership and adaptability. Commanders faced rapid changes in battlefield conditions, yet their decisions were constrained by communication delays and incomplete intelligence. Timing and coordination. Orders to advance often conflicted with on-the-ground realities, highlighting the tension between plan and execution. Communication breakdown. Telegraph lines, runners, and visual signals proved insufficient in fog and artillery chaos. Fragmentation of units. Misalignment of objectives and environmental hazards resulted in the battalion splitting into smaller, often isolated groups.
First-hand reports remain central to understanding human experience in Celtic wood. Disorientation and fatigue. Soldiers report rapidly losing bearings amid smoke, fog, and artillery noise. Moral courage. Despite confusion, individuals displayed remarkable bravery, assisting comrades and attempting to fulfill objectives. Fragmented memory. Survivors' recollections often diverge, reflecting both the chaos of combat and the human mind's coping mechanisms under extreme stress.
Historians examine Celtic wood alongside other small unit engagements in WW1 and prior conflicts, seeking recurring tactical lessons. Environmental influence. Dense forests, cratered fields, and wet terrain consistently challenge operational coherence. Artillery impact. Heavy bombardment not only inflicts casualties, but disrupts coordination and orientation. Unit cohesion. Sustaining operational cohesion under pressure remains a decisive factor in mission success. Combining documentary sources, survivor accounts, and archaeological data allows historians to trace likely battalion pathways. Initial advance. Detailed mapping suggests initial progress was hampered by shell craters and fallen trees. Dispersal events. Artillery barrages and enemy counter-movements caused unit fragmentation. Last known positions. Reconstructions indicate several isolated pockets of soldiers, many of whom vanished from subsequent records.
The human cost of Celtic wood resonates across generations. Descendants' perspectives. Families maintain oral histories, letters, and personal artifacts to preserve memory. Veteran narratives. Memoirs recount both the heroism and the trauma endured, emphasizing the psychological dimension of combat. And cultural representation. Celtic wood is frequently referenced in literature, exhibitions, and documentaries as a symbol of uncertainty, bravery, and sacrifice.
Despite extensive investigation, many questions remain unanswered, fueling scholarly and public fascination. Exact fate of the missing soldiers? While some evidence suggests dispersal and deaths in isolated pockets, no complete resolution exists. Operational factors? The interplay of orders, environmental hazards, and enemy action continues to be analyzed. Narrative continuity. The combination of survivor accounts, partial documentation, and terrain complexity ensures Celtic wood remains a compelling historical puzzle.
Celtic wood continues to inform modern military doctrine and small unit tactics. Lessons drawn emphasize adaptability, preparation, and human factors. Adaptability in command. Rigid adherence to preset plans can prove fatal in fluid environments. Modern forces study the battalion's fragmentation to reinforce flexible command structures. Coordination under fire. The importance of multi-channel communication, radio, runners, visual signals is highlighted, ensuring units remain aligned despite environmental disruption.
Environmental awareness. Dense forests, mud, and shell craters remain classic case studies for terrain assessment and operational planning.
The tragic disappearance of the 71 men provokes enduring ethical considerations. Human cost of orders. Commanders face moral responsibility for lives lost due to decisions made under uncertainty. The role of sacrifice. Soldiers' commitment underscores the tension between duty and survival. Preservation of memory. Ensuring lost soldiers are remembered is a moral obligation, bridging operational lessons with cultural reverence.
Advancements in technology allow unprecedented reconstruction of Celtic wood. 3D terrain modeling, using GIS and photogrammetry, researchers simulate battlefield conditions, revealing movement constraints and hazard points. Battlefield archaeology, recovery of artifacts, rifles, helmets, shell fragments, provides tangible links to the vanished battalion. Digital archives, online repositories centralize diaries, letters, and maps, enhancing access for historians and public audiences alike. Celtic wood has become a symbol of memory continuity across generations. Memorial services, annual events at Ypres and related sites reinforce remembrance. Veterans' narratives, memoirs, letters, and oral histories preserve the lived experience of the lost soldiers. Family custodianship. Descendants safeguard personal effects, photographs, and stories, maintaining emotional and historical continuity.
Modern armed forces integrate Celtic wood into training and doctrine development. Simulation exercises. Units conduct exercises in terrain replicating woodland and cratered environments, studying visibility, coordination, and movement challenges. Leadership training. Officers analyze historical command decisions to understand risks of over-centralized control. Psychological preparedness. Emphasis on stress management, fatigue recognition, and rapid decision-making draws directly from survivor experiences. Celtic wood's narrative persists in academic and public discourse. Debates on unit fragmentation. Scholars explore the interplay of environmental hazards, artillery disruption, and human error. Interpretation of myth and memory. Researchers distinguish factual evidence from anecdotal embellishments, enriching historical accuracy without diminishing drama. Global interest. Military historians in Europe, Australia, and North America engage in cross-comparative studies, ensuring Celtic wood remains internationally recognized.
The battalion's fate provides enduring lessons on human psychology and collective memory. Cognitive strain. Soldiers' accounts highlight disorientation and decision-making under extreme stress. Commemorative practices. Cultural rituals, including plaques, ceremonies, and storytelling, cement the emotional imprint. Literary and media portrayal. Books, documentaries, and digital content perpetuate both factual recounting and dramatic narrative, maintaining audience engagement.
Even after extensive research, Celtic wood retains elements of unsolved mystery. Fate of missing soldiers. While reconstruction suggests dispersal and isolated deaths, definitive records for many individuals remain absent. Impact of fog and artillery. Environmental conditions compounded command and coordination failures, creating ambiguity in unit movements. Survivor memory gaps. Fragmented testimonies continue to challenge historical reconstruction, leaving the story partially unresolved.
The Celtic wood engagement informs modern ethics and education in military history. Moral responsibility. Leaders are reminded of the ethical weight behind operational orders. Historical literacy. Educators use the battalion story to illustrate the human dimension of warfare. Critical analysis skills. Students analyze conflicting reports, terrain data, and survivor accounts, fostering analytical rigor.
Celtic wood stands as a symbol of bravery, tragedy, and historical inquiry. Celtic wood is more than a battlefield. It is a testament to the complexity of war, the fragility of life, and the enduring power of memory. Its study enriches both military understanding and human empathy.